I've heard, for some of you who are freshmen, and it's my first time meeting you, I've heard some of your names and things like that. I hope that doesn't creep you out, but it's just that Core and other mentors have been really excited. And they said, oh, you need to meet so-and-so. So it's great to finally do that. And so again, my name is Mako Nagasawa, and I'm a chaplain here. I work with Connie in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And tonight, I would like to persuade you. Okay? So I would like to persuade you to give all of your life to Jesus, everything you know about yourself to Him and to His mission in the world. And I want to explain why that is by asking this question about human nature. I'm going to actually set up you guys to have some discussion time. And I want to tell you up front what the questions are that I'd like you to discuss. They are these. So in general, number one, what do you believe about human nature? Do we need healing? Okay, so think about that. Do we need healing? Are we somehow broken? And number two, especially for Christians, but even if not, even if you are not, I think there's a way to think about this question and answer it is, what is your transformation story? Has Jesus begun to heal you? If not, or if you haven't experienced Him that way, that's fine. Given what you know about Him and what you know about yourself, how do you think He might heal you and want to address things in you? Okay, so be thinking about that, because in about 20-25 minutes I'll ask you to turn to two other people and talk about these things. So, but first I want to tell you a little bit about my story, just because this is the first time I'm meeting some of you, but also because it illustrates the point. When I was 10 years old, think back to the time when you were 10. The big thing for me was where to kind of define myself and get a sense of identity. And that was really important for me, because I realized somehow when I was about 10 that my mom was doing almost all my homework for me. Right? I mean, I don't know, it's just the Asian mom thing, but she would really make sure that all my answers were right and just kind of make sure I would get straight A's and all these things. There was this project of making California out of dough, right, on a piece of cardboard that I had to do, and my mom did most of it. So I thought, where am I going to make my mark? How am I going to know who I am? And so I turned to competitive swimming as the answer to that question. But here's one of the things that happened, is that swimming is really tough. So when I was 10, there was a time when we were at a swim team, I was on a swim team, and we were wrapping up our workout. And so my coach says, we are going to do relays. And my heart leapt, because I love relays, right? How often do you get to only swim like one lap, and it takes all the time of 8 or 10 laps, right? Because everyone else has to do their part. So I was like really excited, and my mom was there early to pick me up, so I was like, all right, my mom gets to see, where I'm making my mark and stuff. And furthermore, my friend Jack was picked as one of the captains. So I was a little bummed that I wasn't picked captain, but I knew that, okay, Jack was my captain, so I thought I would be picked first because Jack was my friend. He's my friend, right? And wouldn't a friend pick a friend first, especially when his mom is there? But I wasn't picked first. I wasn't picked second. I was picked next to last. And the last kid had breathing problems, right? So you know how I was feeling. And then my coach, to make it even worse, said, all right, we're going to do butterfly relays. And I hated butterfly. Butterfly is the stroke where you swim like a dolphin. You have to bring your entire body up out of the water. And it's so easy to choke on water. So I'm like, all right, this is going to be really hard. And usually in a swimming race, what people do is they send your slowest swimmer first and the fastest last. For whatever reason, my team decided that we were going to reverse that order. So they said, let's give Mako a really big head start. So sure enough, I dove in the water. I had this huge lead, and I did not want to look up and breathe, right? Because I was going to choke on water. So I didn't see the end of the race until I touched the wall, looked up, and saw that he had beaten me in the other lane. I'm like, oh. And as I sat there in my 10-year-old heart, sitting on the edge of the pool, hanging on the gutter of the pool, looking up and saying, oh, my team, what were they doing? They were really kind of depressed, and a little peeved at me, right? Because we had to clean up the pool. We have to pick up the kickboards, take out the lane lines, cover the pool. And the other team, what are they doing? They're cheering me. They're like, and there's my mom. And all of a sudden, in my 10-year-old heart, what do I feel? I make a vow. And I wouldn't have articulated it quite this way back then. But I remember tracing these feelings back to moments like this. And here's the vow. I decided friendship. It doesn't mean a thing. Did it? Friendship. It doesn't mean a thing. The fact that Jack was my friend didn't mean anything. And second, other people's success is based on what? My failure. My failure. And so I decided, all right, I'm going to be successful. That means I need to root for other people's failure. It's like life being graded on a curve. Right? Like one of the most actually anti-Christian things, I think you should get a protest here and say grading on a curve requires failure. How is that Christian? Great, like, how is that? And so I began to root for other people to fail more often than me. And you say, that's really terrible, Mako. Yeah, I was terrible. I became cruel. Like day after day and year after year, there was just this slow buildup that confirmed this posture. I remember thinking, this is shaping who I am and how I see people and how I interact with life. There was one huge thing, though, that started to throw me. And that is when I was in 10th grade, my parents started arguing about getting a divorce. And that was really hard. Obviously, there was a lot of emotional things I was feeling, like the rug had been pulled out from under me. My parents' marriage had never really been good, and yet somehow I assumed that they would always stay together. And the first thing that came to my mind was, well, I'm going through all this stuff, why don't I just check out? Why don't I just be for myself? Why don't I be cruel? And I knew that there was something about that was wrong, but I didn't know why. Something in me said, you can't take that principle and put it here. But I had no idea why. Why is that? So I began asking a ton of questions, like, why does my life suck? But obviously, other ones too. I began to look at my parents and to understand their story in a new way. I saw that my dad was actually where his problems with anger and alcohol came from. That he went through the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and then after, his family got their dignity taken away, they had to try to restart their hotel business in Skid Row in Los Angeles with almost nothing. And he was exposed to violence and alcohol and all these other things. And where was that anger going to go? I saw how his choices shaped the person who he had become, how his heart had been shaped by his circumstances, but also by his own choices. And I saw my mom, how her choices also shaped her heart. She had been raised in a farm in Japan, very punctual family, very disciplined. Farming in Japan, it's pretty tough as a life. And so she was really the backbone in many ways of our family, kind of get us to school, get us to swimming and all these things. And yet her perfectionism became a kind of criticalness that grew and grew and grew. And I saw how it had happened. That there were choices she made. And worst of all, I began to ask myself, am I just becoming like my parents? I can see those things in me. I can see my tendencies to try to escape things, like my dad's alcoholism. But I would get lost in video games and then get upset and start
acting out and being angry in ways. I saw my own criticalness as, well, I see that in my mom. Why am I becoming more and more like this? And I began to wonder, who can change my heart? But not only my heart, also my parents' hearts, if they were to let it happen. Is there someone who could actually change the heart? Who can actually stop human nature from this downward slide and my choices impacting myself? Those are some deep choices and questions, rather, that led me to ask, what about this Jesus? Now, those are some of the most important questions that you can possibly ask yourself. Just the other day, I was in the car listening to the radio, and this song came on. It's Kelly Clarkson's Dark Side. Anyone heard it? No? Well, I'll read some of the lyrics. There is a place that I know. It's not pretty there, and few have ever gone. If I show it to you now, will it make you run away? Or will you stay? Even if it hurts, even if I try to push you out, will you return and remind me who I really am? Please remind me of who I really am. Everybody's got a dark side. Do you love me? Can you love mine? Nobody's a picture perfect. And on she goes. That song and the idea that we have a dark side reminded me of another song by Beyonce called If I Were a Boy, which haunts me. It really does. Because as I thought about my parents' marriage, and my thought was, why do I think my life will end up any differently than theirs, right? And the other woman kind of idea, and which was not, it was something our family had to wrestle with. So, if I were a boy, I would turn off my phone, tell everyone it's broken, so that they'd think I was sleeping alone. I'd put myself first and make the rules as I go, because I know that she'd be faithful, waiting for me to come home. Male infidelity. That is really, really sobering. The idea that, yeah, I know a lot of people who do that. And a Time magazine article with the cover, Infidelity, is it in our genes? Attempts to say that maybe it's in our heart, maybe it's in our human nature, maybe it's in our genetics that we do this. And maybe not just men, but women too. And I'll let you guys discuss that for yourselves. Is that really what's going on? But not just on the level of personal relationships is this significant, but on the level of huge, huge issues, institutions even. Here is Alan Greenspan, Fed chairman during the market crisis, and also, he was a former Fed chairman and kind of a human raisin. But he says, it's human nature. Unless somebody can find a way to change human nature, we will have more crises, and none of them will look like this, because no two crises have anything in common except human nature. He was being interviewed by the BBC, and they asked him, do you think this will happen again? This has been in 2009, and he's talking about the 2008 financial meltdown around the world, and he says, yes, it will happen again. That is totally depressing, guys. Because there's something about human nature. What is it? That we're greedy? That we just take these risks that are stupid? I don't know. What? And what's also interesting is that he was evading responsibility. He was criticized for not doing enough to stop it, but then he goes and blames human nature, which I think it's kind of human nature to evade blame, isn't it? Like, no, it's just everyone else. And it's everyone else's fault. In 1959, a psychologist named Carl Jung, he actually founded some of the archetypes of the Myers-Briggs tests. He says this: we need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. We know nothing of man, far too little. His psyche should be studied, because we are the origin of all coming evil. Wow. That's serious. It confirmed a book that also was published that same year called A Separate Peace. How many of you read this in high school? Yeah, a few of you. Lord of the Flies, any of you read that one? Same basic idea, right? It's why are there wars? Why is there violence? And John Knowles says this: because it seemed clear that wars were not made by generations and their special stupidities, but wars were made instead by something ignorant in the human heart. And he describes this breakdown of friendship between Eugene and Phineas and how it led to Phineas's very sad death. And as Eugene goes to war and thinks about this, what he did, he says, that same thing is propelling us all into conflict. Jesus, in the New Testament, had given a diagnosis just like that. Now, the language he uses is the language of the heart, which let me explain in just a minute. But the things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and those defile the man. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornication, thefts, false witness, slanders. So he says, yes, there is something in us that is the problem. There is an infection or a disease or a corruption in us that was never meant to be there. And the heart is one way that Hebrew writers and people like Jesus would use to say this is a problem internally. The difference is it's not just external, even though, yes, you can have good external circumstances and that will surely help you. But there are more problems inside us that will come out. We cannot get rid of evil simply by fixing our schools or fixing our families or getting better circumstances or making everyone rich. Because we all know that rich people never commit crimes, right? No, of course not. See, these are human problems. They're not circumstantial problems. And he was following along a long line of Jewish thinkers like Jeremiah, who wrote almost 600 years before him. The sin of Judah is written down with an iron stylus. With a diamond point it is engraved upon the tablet of their heart. The heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. Who can understand it? And what these Jewish writers are saying is, hey, look, we are this people, Israel. God gave us a law. We're supposed to follow this, but we keep breaking it. We keep sinning against God and resisting Him. Why? Is it because we need better circumstances? No. Because we're in the promised land, the new garden land. This is what Adam and Eve could have had, or something like it. We can't get much better than this. Do we need better circumstances? No. Do we need better laws? No. The law is fine. We just don't live up to it. And so we are done with external excuses. It must be internal. And in that, they were agreeing with God's diagnosis in the 6th chapter of Genesis. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's the first diagnosis of the human heart. And it is the first of a long line of statements like that. Because the whole reason why God gathered a chosen people was to actually get them to diagnose themselves. It took hundreds, if not thousands of years for Moses to agree with that. One guy to agree in Deuteronomy 30. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart so that you may live. The idea being circumcision is this physical thing, and you all know what circumcision is. It's the cutting away of the foreskin on a male penis, and it symbolically represented something unclean. And essentially, that became the image for what God had to do to the human heart in order to clean it. He had to cut something away. He had to burn it away, separate something from us. And so he uses this language here. I know it's kind of weird, but that's the idea. And arguably, that's why God instituted circumcision for the Jewish people to start with, is to say, you are people who are supposed to be clean. And now, this had to be dealt with. This is what Jesus had to do. So, I want to point out that this issue of evil and human nature is not something that is just Christian, that only Christians talk about this or think about this. But it's actually a lot of people these days. A lot of people. So we are not alone. But there is something that Jesus contributes to the discussion that no one else does, which is this. The human heart can be healed. Human nature can be healed. That thing that was never meant to be in us, the disease or the corruption, this infection, this wound or brokenness, it does not have to stay. It can be healed or begun to be healed. And this is how. I'm going to read a passage to you in just a moment. But I want to put this in context among some of the other things that you've heard maybe about Jesus. Many of you think about Jesus in a way that elevates his death beyond anything else. It's almost in some ways so separated from the rest of Jesus that you would have to really ask, why did Jesus die? Or even, why did Jesus wait so long to die? I mean, tradition tells us he was anywhere between 30 to 40 when he died. But if what was so important about Jesus' death was just that he died, then how come he didn't go to the cross at age 5? Right? So there may be some things that you've heard in your church tradition and whatnot that say, yeah, it's Jesus' death. But if that's true, then how come Jesus wasn't just born onto the cross? If all that mattered was that he die in order to take some aspect of the judicial, retributive wrath of God, then why wasn't he just born there? And if you don't have an answer to that, in fact, if that troubles you, then I hope this answers more questions for you. The reason Jesus didn't just die, and why his life is important, is because he had to retell the human story in himself in order to undo the evil. What he does is he goes through a sequence of events. In this, he goes through what's called the baptism and wilderness temptation experience. He says, or Luke says, now when all the people were baptized, Jesus was also baptized. And while he was praying, heaven was opened, and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in bodily form like a dove, and a voice came out of heaven saying, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." And then Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan and was led around by the Spirit in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and then on he goes. Why does he do this? He is all alone here. This is somehow really important, though, because if Jesus was not accompanied by any followers or disciples at this point, he must have told them, hey, I just went through this. I want you to know about it. Why? It's because he's repeating a very important pattern in the history of his people. Who else went through water and then a wilderness for 40 years in their case? Israel did. The Jewish people. And what did they do there? They failed. They resisted God. And that began their pattern of resistance. See, if it would be like this. If Jesus got on a boat called the Mayflower and set off from England, sailed across the Atlantic and landed at Plymouth, and then got off and began to deal with the Native Americans kindly, fairly, with compassion and friendship, what would he be communicating? He would be saying, the history of the United States, because that is the United States' founding story, right? The history of the U.S. was flawed from the beginning. Let's do it over. I will do it over. I will be the United States as it was truly meant to be. I will undo the sin. And if you join me, we will be part of a new movement to heal the very fabric and the foundations of this nation. What Jesus is doing here is saying, I'm doing that for my people. He is revisiting a place in his own history, that was his people's history, that was really painful because this is where they failed. But he said, let's do it over. I want to be Israel as they were always meant to be. And that is why we say, when Jesus comes into our lives, he will begin to retell our stories, yours and mine. And he will call us to revisit times and places and people where we failed, but now with him and with the presence of God in him and in us, he will begin to undo those mistakes and redeem our stories. It's amazing. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. But how can he do that? It's because he's fixing the human problem. See, when he goes through the wilderness, for example, he's actually tempted. Did you notice that? He's actually tempted. That should actually raise some eyebrows for us, because what is temptation? Temptation is this force that is between 2 points. One is outside you and one is inside you. I'm very tempted by chocolate, right? Because there's something inside me that's responding to something outside me. If you put chocolate in front of me, I would start like drooling. But it's actually kind of bad for me because my body doesn't deal with sugar that well. But if I had no desire for chocolate, I wouldn't be tempted. I would just sit there and say, what is that? Jesus was actually tempted by these things. There was some kind of weakness that he dealt with, some kind of struggle that he was put through, and some kind of brokenness that he inherited because he took on the same human nature you and I have. You know what that's like? Let me give you this analogy here. If all of you can see that picture. This is a picture of a man named Dr. Evan O'Neill Kane, and this is in the year 1926, and what he's doing there is he's operating on himself. He's removing his own appendix. That's just crazy. And he's surrounded by other people, but essentially, he did not need to do this. The reports that I've read say it wasn't that his appendix had burst, but he wanted to take it out. Why would he do that? It's because at that time, we only used general anesthesia. We would put people under, and then it was this major surgery. Nowadays, we can use local anesthesia, and it's a buttonhole, keyhole technique, and it's way less invasive. But essentially, back then, he recognized there are all kinds of people who could not be treated by general anesthesia because they had an allergic reaction. So he said, look, I want to prove to y'all that I could use local anesthesia to remove appendices. But who would volunteer, right? No one. So he operated on himself. He put local anesthesia on himself from the waist, or from the chest down, and then just went in, removed his appendix, and the next day he was out and about. He was up and at 'em. It was incredible. Now, that changed history, because he was able to perform surgeries on other people from that point. And you could say that it's because he performed a surgery on himself. Every surgery he did for others was an outgrowth, an outflow, an outworking of the surgery that he did on himself. And you could say the same about Jesus, but in a deeper way. Jesus took on human nature and performed surgery on himself. He was both the doctor and the patient. There was something in himself that he was fighting and resisting every step of the way of his entire life until he killed it. Like when Harry Potter died and killed that piece of Voldemort's soul that was in himself, that should never have been there, and then he came back, healed of it, cleansed, he had it no more. Jesus came back in his resurrection like that. He was God's new humanity. Humanity as God always intended. And now he was able to share himself by his Spirit with anyone who asked. Because you know what? If there's a God who didn't do that, then God would be complicit with human evil, and he would therefore be evil. If God is not addressing the root problem of evil in human nature, in every single one of us, then he would by definition be evil. It's really not fun or attractive to believe in any other God. This was really different. And so Jesus begins to retell our stories by coming into us and sharing with us his new humanity. By being in our lives. And I want to help you understand this through a diagram. This was a kind of a diagram that friends of mine drew, and you can see on the top it says Jesus' story here. Jesus starts off with this as a person, as a human, fully God and fully human. What it means to be fully human is to inherit the crack in human nature. See that crack there? So that's representing this brokenness. And here, he is divine. He dies and rises again and comes out of his resurrection as a new, healed, cleansed, God-soaked, God-drenched human being. He's done and with that problem. And now he's able to share his human nature with the rest of us. What's that like? Well, and I'll share a little bit for me. What this looks like is, here's me. I start off with a very pronounced crack. That wound defines me. Yes, I'm made in the image of God, and there is goodness there. But there is also this problem. Jesus calls me to join him. And when I do, he says, it will feel like dying and rising. It will feel hard but good. He said, if anyone comes to me, you must pick up your cross, but you will find life in me, right? It will feel like dying, but also rising. And that is what it felt like, and what it feels like for anyone coming to him. And on the other side, here is me. I still have the crack. I'm not perfected, but I have to wrestle now with new strength and power because Jesus is in me. And then there's this arrow here reflecting that my story is not yet over. There will be a point when Jesus returns and makes all things new. He will make me new, and he will restore me fully to the person God always wanted. And that is true for you. So let me tell you a bit of what this is like. This is what I call my transformation story, and you might think of your story in these three terms as well. See, when I was young, in high school, and my parents started arguing about divorce, I would just leave. I mean, in 10th grade, I got my car and my keys, and I was out of there. I would play video games at my friends' houses. I would distract myself. I would go to the park and just sit there. It was my pattern to run away from my problems. That reflected the selfishness that was in me. I had developed a cruel way of responding to others, and that was entirely my fault. Jesus said, come to me and it will be hard, but good. Give me that issue. So a few years later, when I was going home 1 year from college, back to the LA area where my parents lived and where I grew up, I felt like Jesus said, Mako, I want you to stay at home as much as you can. I don't want you to run away this time. I want you to be with your younger sister, listen to your parents, and pray for them. I want you to be there. And I said, no, don't make me do that, please, because I've never done that. That's crazy. That's the hard part. I said, Jesus, if you want me to do that, you have to give me the strength and courage and love in ways that I've never experienced before. And so I went home, and he did. There was one long conversation. Well, essentially, my dad's alcohol problems got to such a point that my mom said, forget it, I'm done, let's get a divorce. And we're too poor to afford a lawyer, so they said, Mako, we want you to arbitrate the conversation about who gets what. And when they said that, I'm like, why me? You think I'm neutral? I don't have any feelings one way or the other? I can do this? And I felt the most manipulated, the most overlooked, and the most used that I ever felt in my life. And yet, as I walked into that conversation and prayed, Jesus, would you be with me? Help me to be here. I felt more loved than at any time before. It was amazing. I was able to hear my parents in ways that I know I've heard this stuff before from them, but somehow I heard it in a fresh sense. It was incredible. A few days later, I'd gone to bed at about 10:30 p.m. And all of a sudden, I was awake at 1:18 a.m. and I remember that very clearly because I had this digital clock right next to my bed, and I was supposed to go to summer school the next day. So I thought it was really weird that I'd woken up and I was instantly wide awake. That never happens to me. So I decided to go downstairs and get a drink of water, and as I go down the stairs, I noticed that the doorway to the garage, because we have an off-house garage, was actually, there was light underneath the doorway. And so I go through the door, and there's my mom sitting in the car having turned it on with the garage door down. She was committing suicide. So I just rush over to my mom. I take the key, and I talk with her for 30 minutes or something, and she didn't want to come out, so I let her be, and I go talk to my dad and tell him what happened. I go like hide the key somewhere so that she can get it. But let me just ask you this. Who do you think woke me up? See, I've looked at this from many, many angles because I never wake up like that. I never wake up and I'm wide awake. It was uncanny. I think Jesus woke me up because what was he doing as he was retelling my story and healing my heart, healing my human nature? He was joining me to the one who loves my parents more than I did, the one who neither slumbers nor sleeps. He woke me up. See, this is what it means to come to Jesus and to allow him into your heart to change you at the very core of who you are so that you become a different person. Come to Jesus, y'all, because it might save someone else's life. At the end of that summer, I was talking to a good friend of mine who had gone through a few years ago, a difficult time divorce in his family. And he was telling me, about that and asking me how it was for me. And I was saying, it's been hard. It's been really hard. I've never felt like this before. But at the same time, I've never felt more loved and I've never felt more loving. And I was telling him about these incidents, and he said words that I will never forget. I'll treasure them. And he said, Mako, how can you be so other-centered at a time like this? And I treasure those words because they remind me who Jesus is, of the love of Jesus, the power of Jesus, the goodness of Jesus, the presence of Jesus. This is what it means for him to be in our lives, to heal us from the deepest place of who we are, and to undo the damage that we have done to others and to ourselves. That is what it means. That is why he went through that water and wilderness. That is why he comes into our lives, to share himself. And so I want to leave you with these questions to think about. Do you believe that human nature needs healing? And however you can engage with this question, please think about it. Is how has Jesus started to heal you? Or again, if you haven't experienced him that way, to the best of your knowledge of him and the best of your knowledge of yourself, how do you think he might want to heal you? And with that, turn to one or two other people, introduce yourself. If you don't know each other, this is a time for us to know each other as a community, even as we're engaging in these very deep questions, and go for it for about 10 minutes, and then I'll come back and close this.